The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the grand ballroom of the Beacon Hill Country Club. My father Richard stood at the mahogany podium, the warm glow of the chandeliers highlighting the silver in his hair. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of his 35-year career as a senior partner at a top-tier wealth management firm. Instead, he used his retirement speech for his favorite pastime, which was publicly humiliating me. He leaned into the microphone, a cruel smile playing on his lips, and pointed directly at my table. "Look at her, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "This is my daughter Jada. No college degree, no real career, no future. Just a 35-year-old woman still looking for free rides off the family name while her sister actually builds a life." The room full of Boston elite burst into uncomfortable but compliant laughter. I felt 200 pairs of eyes burn into my skin. At the head table, my mother Patricia took a delicate sip of her champagne, not bothering to hide her smirk. Next to her, my sister Simone, the undisputed golden child, leaned into her husband Andre, whispering something that made them both chuckle softly. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my head, stare at my untouched plate of filet mignon, and take the emotional beating just like I had done for the past 3 decades. I was the designated scapegoat, the college dropout, the failure they kept around simply to make themselves feel superior. But they had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. The woman sitting at that table was not the helpless girl they thought they knew. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flush with embarrassment. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the marble floor with a sharp sound that cut through the dying laughter. I stood up tall, smoothing the front of my understated but tailored black dress. I picked up my crystal flute of sparkling water, looking directly into my father's eyes. The smug satisfaction on his face faltered for a fraction of a second as I raised my glass high enough for the entire ballroom to see. I kept my voice perfectly calm, projecting it clearly across the sudden hush of the room. "Cheers, Richard," I said, the use of his first name sending a visible shockwave through the crowd. "Enjoy the retirement, because this is the very last time you will ever see me." I set the glass down with a definitive clink, turned my back on the podium, and began walking toward the heavy oak double doors. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute and deafening. Not a single fork clattered against a plate. Not a single cough broke the tension. The only sound was the rhythmic click of my heels against the polished marble, echoing like a countdown. As I pushed open the heavy brass-handled doors and stepped out into the grand foyer, I felt an immense suffocating weight lift off my chest. I walked past the shocked coat check attendant and stepped out into the crisp autumn air of the Boston night. My name is Jada. I am 35 years old, and I am the founder of a financial technology company that recently sold for $42 million. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent Massachusetts neighborhood meant that keeping up appearances was the only religion my parents practiced. Richard and Patricia cared more about the country club roster and the opinions of their wealthy neighbors than they ever cared about my well-being. From a young age, it was made abundantly clear that I was the disappointment. Simone was the perfect daughter, the one who married Andre, a man who mirrored my father's corporate greed perfectly. Together, they formed an impenetrable wall of condescension. When I dropped out of university 10 years ago to teach myself coding and build my first software program, I was officially labeled the family failure. They told all their friends I was going through a confused phase. They offered me entry-level receptionist jobs at their firms, acting as if they were throwing scraps to a stray dog. I refused their help, packed my bags, and moved into a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city to build my vision in total secrecy. Over the next decade, I worked 90-hour weeks, living on instant noodles and pure spite. I taught myself algorithms, predictive financial modeling, and high-frequency trading data structures. While my family spent their weekends at charity galas gossiping about my lack of ambition, I was quietly securing venture capital funding and building a proprietary financial platform that was currently disrupting the very industry my father had dedicated his life to. They thought my cheap apartment was a sign of poverty, but it was simply the camouflage I needed to build my empire without their interference. Tonight was the breaking point. Tonight was the moment I realized that no amount of success would ever change their need to crush me. I reached into my purse and pulled out my car keys, the cold metal grounding me in the reality of what I had just done. I had finally severed the cord. As I walked toward the valet stand, I could hear the heavy country club doors swing open behind me. Heavy footsteps echoed on the pavement, moving fast. I did not need to turn around to know exactly who they had sent to reel me back into my designated place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. The crisp night air did little to cool the heavy thud of the footsteps closing the distance behind me. I handed my ticket to the wide-eyed valet who had clearly heard the commotion from the ballroom. Just as the young man sprinted off to retrieve my vehicle, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. The grip was intentionally tight, designed to intimidate. I turned slowly, brushing the hand away with a deliberate flick of my wrist. It was Andre. My brother-in-law stood there, his custom-tailored tuxedo looking slightly rumpled from his hurried sprint across the gravel driveway. His jaw was clenched and the veins in his neck stood out in sharp relief against his dark skin. He was breathing heavily, not just from the run, but from the sheer audacity of my rebellion. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Jada?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper, meant to keep the remaining country club staff from overhearing. "You are going to turn right back around, march into that ballroom, and apologize to your father. You are ruining Richard's night, and you are embarrassing Simone." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. For years, Andre had acted as my father's enforcer. Ever since he married my sister, he had seamlessly adopted my family's favorite hobby of putting me in my place. He thought his six-figure corporate salary and his position at my father's firm gave him the ultimate authority over my life. He loved to flaunt his leased sports cars and heavily financed luxury watches, always making sure I knew how completely out of my league he believed I was. "I am not going anywhere. Andre, except home," I replied, keeping my voice entirely level. My car, a modest four-year-old sedan that blended perfectly into my carefully constructed facade, pulled up to the curb. The valet stepped out, holding the door open. I moved toward it, but Andre stepped into my path, his chest puffed out in a classic display of false dominance. He slammed his hand against the roof of the car, the loud thud making the valet jump back in shock. "You are not leaving," he sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "Who do you think you are, acting like some high and mighty executive in there? You are a college dropout, Jada. You quit school 10 years ago, and you have done absolutely nothing with your life since. You live in a cheap apartment on the edge of the city, while we subsidize your existence by simply acknowledging you." His words were designed to hit every insecurity my family had spent decades planting inside my head. In the past, a barrage like this would have made my throat tighten. I would have looked at the ground, apologized, and retreated back to my dark corner. But tonight, his insults sounded like a poorly rehearsed script. He was completely oblivious to the reality that my cheap apartment was a conscious choice to keep my assets hidden. He had no idea that my lack of a degree had not stopped me from building a financial technology company worth more than he would ever see in his entire lifetime. "You owe this family," Andre continued, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "Richard gave you everything. Simone covers for your failures constantly, and this is how you repay them, by throwing a tantrum at a public event. You are acting like a bitter, jealous child because you cannot stand the fact that we are successful, and you are exactly where you have always been, at the absolute bottom." I let him finish. I let him expend all his aggressive energy while I simply observed the sweat forming on his forehead. He was desperate to regain control of the narrative. The valet was standing a few feet away, looking absolutely terrified, pretending to examine a completely spotless rim on the next car over, just to avoid eye contact with us. "Andre," I said, my tone so dangerously calm that it finally made him pause. "Move your hand right now." I did not raise my voice. I did not match his aggressive energy. I simply issued a cold command. He blinked, staring at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The blind compliance he was so used to extracting from me was gone, and he did not know how to process the empty space it left behind. He tried to double down, gripping the edge of the open car door with his other hand, physically blocking me from getting inside the vehicle. I said, "Get back in there," he barked, though his voice lacked the absolute conviction it held a moment ago. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I reached out and placed my hand over his where it gripped the door frame. My fingers were cold against his warm skin. I did not try to pry his hand away with brute force. I simply pressed my thumb directly into the nerve cluster on the back of his hand, applying a sharp, precise pressure that I had learned in a self-defense class years ago. His eyes widened in shock, and his fingers immediately uncurled from the metal with a sharp intake of breath. Before he could recover his balance, I slipped smoothly into the driver's seat. He stumbled back, rubbing his hand, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. "You are making a huge mistake, Jada," he yelled, leaning down toward the open window. "If you drive away right now, Richard will cut you off completely. You will have nothing at all. No family, no financial support, no future. You will be begging us to take you back by tomorrow morning." I reached out and pressed the ignition button. The engine hummed to life, a quiet, steady rhythm that perfectly matched my own heartbeat. I looked at Andre one last time, committing his desperate, angry expression to memory. "I am counting on it," I said softly. I reached for the window control button on the door panel. Andre opened his mouth to launch into another loud tirade about my perceived failures, but the glass was already rising. It slid up silently, cutting off his harsh words mid-sentence. Through the tinted glass, I watched him throw his hands up in total frustration, shouting something I could no longer hear. I put the car in drive and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the brilliant lights of the country club behind me. I checked the rearview mirror once, seeing Andre standing alone in the driveway, a tiny, angry figure shrinking into the distance until he disappeared completely into the shadows. The drive home was incredibly peaceful. For the first time in 35 years, the heavy, suffocating cloud of my family's expectations had completely vanished. I turned on the radio, letting the soft jazz wash over me as I navigated the winding, dark roads back toward the city limits. But I knew the peace would be temporary. My father was not a man who ever accepted defeat, and Andre would undoubtedly twist this parking lot encounter to make himself look like the innocent victim. Tomorrow morning, they would inevitably launch their next counterattack, completely unaware that they were bringing a dull knife to a corporate gunfight. The morning sun was just beginning to stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bedroom when the aggressive buzzing of my phone shattered the quiet. It was barely 6 in the morning. Most people waking up the day after a massive family blowout would expect a text asking if they were okay, or perhaps demanding an explanation for their sudden departure. But I knew my mother better than that. Patricia did not care about my emotional state. She only cared about the ledger. I rolled over and picked up the device, watching the screen light up with a rapid-fire sequence of messages. There were 12 texts in total, all from her. I did not even have to unlock the screen to know exactly what tone she was using. I sat up against the tufted velvet headboard and opened the thread. The first message was a masterclass in sweeping reality under the rug. It read simply, "I hope you have slept off whatever childish tantrum you threw last night. We are moving past it." The second text arrived a minute later, getting straight to the point. "Your share for your father's retirement gift is $5,000. We bought him the Platinum Country Club bond. I expect the wire transfer by noon today." I stared at the screen, letting out a short, dry laugh. She completely ignored the fact that I had publicly disowned them less than 12 hours ago in front of their entire social circle. In her mind, I was still the obedient scapegoat who would desperately buy my way back into their good graces by opening my wallet. But it was the text that followed that truly showcased Patricia's favorite weapon, which was historical revisionism. When I did not reply immediately, she unleashed the guilt trip she had been refining for a decade. "Do not ignore me, Jada," she wrote. "You owe us this. Need I remind you who took you in when your silly little computer business failed 10 years ago? We put a roof over your head when you had absolutely nothing. The least you can do is contribute to the family that kept you off the streets. Stop being so selfish." I read those words and felt a familiar tightness in my chest, not from hurt, but from the sheer audacity of her lies. Let me set the record straight about her version of history. 10 years ago, when I dropped out of college to pursue my tech startup, I ran out of funding within the first 6 months. I was 25, terrified, and completely broke. I swallowed my pride and went to my parents asking for a short-term loan of $3,000 just to keep my servers running. They laughed in my face. Richard told me my ideas were worthless. Patricia told me I was an embarrassment. They did not take me in with open arms. They allowed me to sleep on a broken futon in their unheated basement for exactly 3 weeks, while I worked double shifts at a diner to save up for my first apartment. During those 3 weeks, it was the middle of November. I slept in a winter coat because they refused to turn on the basement heating zone to save money on their utility bill. They charged me daily rent for using the basement bathroom and made me pay for my own groceries, keeping my cheap ramen noodles strictly separated from their imported cheeses in the refrigerator. They constantly paraded Simone and Andre around me, highlighting their corporate promotions while treating me like a stray animal they deeply regretted feeding. That was the grand rescue Patricia was now holding over my head to extort $5,000. She truly believed her own twisted narrative. She had repeated the story of the gracious parents saving the reckless daughter so many times at her country club charity luncheons that it had become her absolute truth. My phone buzzed again in my hand. It was another text from her, followed by a photo attachment. It was a screenshot of the country club invoice with the $5,000 balance highlighted in red. "I already told the bond committee you were covering the remaining balance," she wrote. "Do not embarrass me, Jada. Send the money." She was using my supposed humiliation to cover her own financial obligations. It was a classic Patricia move. She loved spending money. She did not have to impress people she did not even like. And then demanding I foot the bill as a form of penance for my existence. In the past, a morning like this would have completely ruined me. I would have spent hours agonizing over the texts, crying over the profound unfairness of it all. I would have drained my meager savings account just to send the money, hoping it would buy me a fleeting moment of their approval. I would have composed long, desperate paragraphs, trying to remind her of the truth, begging her to see me and love me for who I really was. But that Jada was gone. That Jada died in that freezing basement 10 years ago, holding a cheap laptop and a dream no one else believed in. I sat there listening to the quiet hum of my building's central air conditioning, feeling the cool, smooth fabric of my luxury sheets against my skin. The sheer disconnect between her perception of me and my actual reality was almost comical. She thought she was texting a desperate failure who would scramble to find $5,000 to appease her. She was throwing her best punches at a ghost. My phone screen lit up one more time. It was a follow-up text, short and venomous. "If I do not have the wire confirmation by noon, you can consider yourself uninvited from the Thanksgiving dinner next month. Actions have consequences, Jada." I stared at that final sentence. Actions have consequences. It was the favorite family catchphrase usually reserved for whenever I stepped out of line. But reading it now, it felt less like a threat and more like a promise. For 35 years, I had absorbed the consequences of their actions. I had carried their shame, their projections, and their endless need for a scapegoat. The texts glowing on my screen were not just demands for money, they were the desperate grasps of a woman realizing she was losing control. She needed me to pay that $5,000, not because they could not afford it, but because my compliance was the only way she could validate her superiority. The urge to respond bubbled up inside me for a brief second. A part of me wanted to send a picture of my living room or a screenshot of my latest venture capital meeting, just to watch her fragile ego shatter. But I quickly pushed the thought away. Replying would show that her words still had the power to move me. It would show that I still cared enough to fight back. And the truth was, I did not care anymore. The opposite of love is not hate, it is absolute indifference. I let the phone screen dim and fade to black, plunging her toxic words back into the dark where they belonged. The first text trap had been set, but I was no longer the frightened girl willing to step into it. I tapped the screen one more time, bringing up the contact settings for Patricia. Without a single ounce of hesitation or regret, I pressed the block caller button. I watched her name disappear from my active directory. I did the exact same thing for Richard. Then I blocked Simone. Finally, I blocked Andre. The digital silence that instantly filled my bedroom was incredibly liberating. It was the very first morning in my adult life that I did not start my day managing their manufactured crises or absorbing their projected insecurities. I tossed the silenced phone onto the nightstand and pushed back the heavy duvet. Walking across the heated hardwood floors, I headed straight for my home office. It was a minimalist space encased in glass overlooking the waking city below. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and woke up my laptop. The sleek silver machine hummed to life, instantly recognizing my biometric scan. I opened my heavily encrypted browser and navigated to my primary private banking portal. The login process required a complex passphrase and a secondary physical security token. I typed in the credentials, verified my identity, and waited for the dashboard to load. The screen refreshed, displaying a clean interface with a simple greeting. "Welcome back, Jada." Directly below the greeting in bold, crisp font sat my total liquid portfolio balance, $42,350,000. The number was so large it almost looked abstract on the screen. It did not come from a trust fund, a lucky inheritance, or a wealthy husband. Every single digit represented a sleepless night, a brutal pitch meeting, a line of flawless code, and an absolute refusal to let my family's low expectations dictate my reality. Just 3 months ago, a massive private equity firm closed the acquisition of my financial technology startup. For years, I had been quietly building a predictive risk assessment software designed to automatically flag toxic corporate debt and hidden embezzlement patterns. Major banks and investment firms were suddenly desperate to acquire my algorithm to clean up their portfolios. When the massive wire transfer finally hit my account, I did not buy a fleet of exotic cars or post a screenshot on social media. I told absolutely no one. I kept wearing my unmarked black sweaters, driving my reliable sedan, and living my quiet life. My family loved to perform wealth. They treated status like a competitive sport. Richard leased luxury vehicles he traded in every 2 years, just to ensure his neighbors saw the temporary license plates. Patricia bought designer handbags on credit cards with exorbitant interest rates, carefully positioning them in family photos. Simone and Andre financed a lifestyle that was entirely dependent on their next corporate bonus. They were constantly stressed, constantly posturing, and constantly terrified that someone might discover their precarious financial house of cards. They equated visible spending with actual human value. They honestly believed I was broke because I did not wear logos or brag about exclusive dinner reservations. They thought my refusal to participate in their endless consumerism was a symptom of extreme poverty. I remembered a family dinner 2 years ago when Simone openly mocked my plain leather boots, claiming they offended her aesthetic sensibilities. I had just secured $10 million in venture capital funding that very afternoon, but I simply smiled and let her feel superior. In reality, my quiet wealth could have bought Richard's entire wealth management firm in cash, with enough left over to purchase their precious country club and turn it into a public parking lot. I was not just financially secure, I was completely untouchable. I looked at the $42 million balance and thought about Patricia demanding $5,000 to cover her own country club bond. The irony was so sharp, it was almost poetic. She was threatening to uninvite me to a holiday dinner over a sum of money I generated in passive interest before I even finished my morning coffee. Furthermore, I knew exactly why she was demanding the money. Richard's firm had been taking massive hits lately, and their cash flow was drying up. They were playing a petty, desperate game of checkers, while I had been quietly mastering chess for an entire decade. I closed the banking portal, clearing the cache and browser history out of sheer habit. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the tiny cars navigating the morning traffic. My family was entirely predictable. I knew Richard well enough to anticipate his exact retaliation strategy. When blocking his calls failed to produce the groveling apology he desired, he would immediately attack my basic survival needs. He would go after my housing because he firmly believed he controlled the city and everyone in it. He knew the landlord of my old cheap apartment building because they played golf together at the very club I had just walked out of. He would make one phone call and demand they serve me an eviction notice, assuming it would force me onto the streets and straight back to his doorstep begging for mercy. They thought I was still living in that rundown building on the edge of town. They had no idea I had secretly purchased this massive penthouse in cash 3 months ago, keeping my old apartment simply to maintain the illusion of my struggles. "Let him try," I whispered to the empty room. For 35 years they had used money as a weapon to keep me in line. They weaponized holidays, birthday gifts, and minor favors, ensuring I always felt indebted and inferior to them. They wanted me small, manageable, and completely desperate for their conditional approval. But the balance in that bank account was much more than just numbers on a screen. It was impenetrable armor. It was the ultimate shield against their lifelong campaign of emotional subjugation. I walked into my modern kitchen and turned on the espresso machine. The rich, complex aroma of dark roast coffee filled the air, a stark and beautiful contrast to the bitter, cheap instant coffee I used to drink in their freezing basement. I poured the steaming liquid into a simple ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip, enjoying the absolute quiet of my sanctuary. The day was young, and the board was set. My family was about to learn that the scapegoat they had been kicking around for decades was actually the one holding the keys to the entire kingdom. They wanted to teach me that actions have consequences, and I was finally ready to show them exactly what that meant. The quiet peace of my morning routine was interrupted by a sharp chime from my laptop. It was an incoming email marked with high importance. The sender was Mr. Henderson, the property manager of the dilapidated apartment building on the edge of the city where I had officially resided for the past 10 years. I set my espresso mug down on the marble island and tapped the trackpad to open the message. Attached was a formal legal document. I did not even need to read the fine print to know exactly what it was. It was a 30-day notice to vacate the premises. The formal grounds listed for the sudden termination of my month-to-month lease were vague, citing a sudden need for building renovations and ownership restructuring. But Mr. Henderson had included a brief personal note below the attachment. He wrote that he was incredibly sorry, but the directive had come directly from the corporate ownership group first thing this morning and his hands were completely tied. I leaned back against the kitchen counter and let out a soft laugh. My father had wasted absolutely no time. Richard loved to boast about his extensive network of high society connections, and he wielded those relationships like a blunt instrument whenever someone dared to challenge his authority. He played golf every single Sunday with the real estate developers who owned half the low-income housing in the city, including my old building. It would have taken him exactly one phone call between the 9th and 10th holes to cash in a favor and have my lease terminated. In his mind, he was cutting off my oxygen supply. He honestly believed that dilapidated studio with the drafty windows and the constantly leaking radiator was my only sanctuary in the world. He thought he was throwing me out onto the cold concrete. Just as I was closing the email, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up, displaying an unknown local number. I had blocked the entire family, but Richard was a man of infinite resources when it came to harassment. I let the phone ring out, watching it vibrate across the smooth stone surface until it finally went to voicemail. A minute later, the notification popped up indicating a new audio message. I tapped the screen and put it on speakerphone, letting his voice fill my massive sunlit kitchen. "Good morning, Jada." His voice echoed crisp and dripping with absolute smugness. He was calling from his executive assistant's line. "I assume by now you have checked your email and received a little update regarding your living situation. You see, the real world does not tolerate the kind of disrespect you displayed last night. You thought you could make a scene at my club, humiliate me in front of my colleagues, and just walk away without consequences. But you have absolutely nothing. I made one simple phone call to the property group this morning, and suddenly your lease is completely void. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your pathetic little life and get out of that building." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air, ensuring I felt the full weight of his manufactured power. "Useless people get left behind. Jada," he continued, his tone shifting from anger to a chilling, patronizing calm. "You have spent your entire life contributing nothing, taking up space, and pretending you are somehow superior to this family. Now you get to see how the real world treats a 35-year-old college dropout with no safety net. You will be on the street." He took a deep breath, ready to deliver the final manipulative blow. It was the classic Richard pivot, where he positioned himself as the benevolent savior right after acting as the ruthless executioner. "Now, because I am a generous father, I am willing to make this entire problem go away. I am giving you one chance to fix this. Come to the house tonight at 7 o'clock sharp. You will stand in the living room, and you will apologize to me. You will apologize to your mother for stressing her out, and you will beg Simone and Andre for forgiveness after the way you spoke to them in the parking lot. You will show some actual gratitude for everything we have done for you. If you can manage to swallow your foolish pride and do exactly what I say, I might make another phone call and let you keep your miserable little box of an apartment. If not, you are entirely on your own. The choice is yours. Make the right one." The voicemail ended with a sharp click, leaving the penthouse in total silence once again. I stood there looking around my $4 million home. The walls were adorned with original artwork I had purchased at a private gallery in Milan. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the city skyline, including the financial district where Richard's firm was currently struggling to stay afloat. I looked down at the phone and felt a profound sense of pity for the man. His entire sense of self-worth was built on the illusion of control. He was trying to crush me by taking away a $1,200 a month apartment, completely oblivious to the fact that I generated that exact amount of money in passive interest every few hours. He wanted me desperate. He wanted me to show up at his manicured suburban estate tonight, trembling and crying, begging for a roof over my head. He wanted Patricia to watch from the sofa with a smug smile while Simone and Andre gloated over my complete submission. It was a sick theatrical play they had been running for my entire life, and Richard had just confidently set the stage for the grand finale. But the lead actress had already rewritten the script. I picked up my phone and deleted the voicemail without a second thought. I did not save it for evidence. I did not need to. The beauty of absolute financial independence is that you no longer have to prove to your abusers that they are wrong. You simply let them exhaust themselves, fighting an opponent who has already left the arena. I was not going to call his assistant back. I was not going to contact Mr. Henderson to fight the eviction notice. Fighting it would only signal to Richard that his attack had landed. It would validate his delusion that he held power over my survival. Instead, I walked over to the entryway of my penthouse, where I kept a small silver bowl for my keys. I reached in and pulled out the cheap brass key to the old apartment. I had kept the lease active on that crumbling studio precisely for this reason. It was my decoy. It was the piece of cheese I left in the mousetrap for them to aggressively attack while I moved millions of dollars in the background. My real life, the one filled with board meetings, venture capital, and immense corporate power, was entirely invisible to them. And because they were so blinded by their own arrogance, they never once stopped to question how I remained so calm in the face of their constant threats. I walked back to the kitchen counter and placed the brass key next to my laptop. Richard's 30-day eviction notice was not a punishment. It was a perfectly timed administrative cleanup. I had been meaning to close out that old lease anyway, and my father had just saved me the trouble of drafting the cancellation paperwork. I smiled genuinely for the first time that morning. The game was escalating exactly as I had predicted. They were tightening a noose around a phantom while the real Jada was preparing to buy the very ground they walked on. I did not waste another minute dwelling on Richard's hollow threats. I grabbed my car keys and drove across the city to the dilapidated building that had served as my flawless camouflage for the past decade. Pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot, I looked up at the faded brick facade and the rusted fire escapes. For years, my family had driven past this exact spot, pointing and whispering about my tragic downfall. They thought this building was my prison. They never realized it was actually my fortress. Walking up the 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken since I first moved in, I felt a wave of profound nostalgia. I unlocked the heavy metal door and stepped into the cramped studio apartment. It smelled faintly of old radiator metal and cheap cleaning supplies. The space was exactly as I had left it. A worn-out futon serving as a couch, a wobbly particle board desk, and a tiny kitchen with linoleum flooring that had been peeling at the corners for years. This was the poverty they were so desperate to weaponize against me. This was the stage where they believed my tragic life was playing out. I had no intention of calling moving companies or renting a truck. I had already moved my most important possessions into the penthouse weeks ago. The only things left in this studio were the props: the cheap clothes, the bargain bin dishes, the discount store towels. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a single duffel bag. I packed a few sentimental items. My original business ledger filled with handwritten code and ambitious projections. The first prototype motherboard I had soldered myself. The rejection letters from venture capitalists that I had pinned to the wall as daily motivation. Everything else could stay. I spent exactly 20 minutes packing up the last 10 years of my supposed failure. I did not take the futon. I did not take the cheap television. I wanted the landlord, and by extension Richard, to see exactly how little I cared about the life they thought they were taking away from me. I walked into the tiny kitchen and pulled a bright yellow sticky note from a drawer. I grabbed a pen and wrote 3 simple words: "Keep the deposit." I placed the sticky note squarely in the center of the scratched laminate countertop. I took the brass key off my keyring and set it perfectly on top of the yellow paper. It was the ultimate resignation letter. It was a silent testament to the fact that their grand punishment meant absolutely nothing to me. I zipped up the duffel bag, took one last look around the tiny room that had birthed a multi-million-dollar empire, and walked out, locking the door behind me for the final time. The drive from the edge of the city to the heart of the downtown financial district took exactly 35 minutes. With every mile, the scenery shifted dramatically. The cracked pavements and boarded-up storefronts gave way to pristine sidewalks, towering glass skyscrapers, and high-end boutiques. I pulled up to the sleek black marble entrance of the most exclusive residential high-rise in the city. The uniformed valet immediately stepped forward, opening my door with a respectful nod. "Welcome back, ma'am," he said smoothly, taking my keys to park my modest sedan in the secure underground garage next to the imported sports cars of my neighbors. I smiled, acknowledging him as I walked through the revolving glass doors into the expansive lobby. The air here smelled of expensive cedar and fresh orchids. The concierge waved politely as I bypassed the main elevators and walked directly to the private resident lift at the back of the hall. I swiped my encrypted key fob, and the brushed steel doors slid open silently. There were no buttons to press. The elevator was programmed to recognize my fob and take me directly to the top floor. The doors opened directly into my foyer. I stepped off the elevator and dropped my duffel bag onto the imported Italian marble floor. The penthouse spanned the entire top floor of the building, offering a massive open-concept sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling glass wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering a breathtaking 360-degree view of the city skyline. The late afternoon sun poured into the space, illuminating the custom modern furniture, the massive chef's kitchen, and the private wraparound terrace. I walked out onto the terrace, the wind catching my hair as I looked down at the bustling streets far below. I had purchased this penthouse entirely in cash 3 months ago, the day my corporate buyout was finalized. I had used a blind trust to ensure my name never appeared on any public property records. Richard prided himself on knowing every major real estate transaction in the city, but he had completely missed the sale of its most expensive residential property right under his nose. From my terrace, I could clearly see the distinctive triangular roof of Richard's wealth management firm just 3 blocks away. I rested my hands on the glass railing, staring at the building where my father was undoubtedly sitting in his corner office, congratulating himself on rendering me homeless. He probably thought I was sitting on a park bench somewhere, crying into my hands, desperately trying to figure out how to beg for his forgiveness. The contrast between his manufactured reality and my actual life was staggering. They had spent their entire lives trying to push me down into the dirt, but the pressure had only forced me to learn how to fly. I was not just out of their reach, I was hovering entirely above their atmosphere. I took a deep breath of the crisp, high-altitude air, feeling a profound sense of absolute ownership over my life and my destiny. I walked back inside and poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the smart refrigerator. My phone remained completely silent on the kitchen island, ensuring that Richard's 7 o'clock deadline would pass without a single word from me. I was not going to his house. I was not going to apologize. I was going to spend the evening reviewing the financial portfolio of his failing company, preparing for the moment I would finally dismantle his carefully constructed kingdom. The evening passed in a state of absolute tranquility. I ordered high-end takeout from a restaurant Richard could barely afford to dine at, and ate it while looking over corporate acquisition documents. When 7 o'clock arrived, I did not even glance at the clock. By 9 o'clock, I was fast asleep in my king-sized bed, wrapped in Egyptian cotton, completely undisturbed by the raging inferno of anger that I knew was currently consuming my parents' suburban home. The next morning, I woke up feeling more refreshed than I had in years. I decided to treat myself to an artisanal pastry and a pour-over coffee at an upscale cafe just 2 blocks from my building. It was a place known for its exclusivity and quiet atmosphere, a perfect spot to read the morning financial news. I had no idea that my simple choice of a morning coffee spot was about to trigger the next massive collision with the family I had just left behind. The scent of freshly roasted Ethiopian coffee beans and warm butter from the bakery case filled the quiet air of the upscale cafe. I was sitting at a small marble table near the window, enjoying the absolute serenity of my morning. My tablet was propped up in front of me, displaying the latest quarterly earnings reports for the regional wealth management sector. I was specifically analyzing the catastrophic financial metrics of my father's firm. The numbers were even worse than I had initially calculated. They were hemorrhaging cash, and their client retention rate was in a freefall. I took a slow sip of my pour-over coffee, relishing the complex flavor, when a sudden sharp tapping sound broke my concentration. I looked up from my screen to see my sister Simone standing directly across from me. She was wearing a pristine white designer blazer that cost more than my old apartment's annual rent, and her signature diamond tennis bracelet caught the morning light. However, her perfectly manicured exterior could not hide the frantic energy radiating from her eyes. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the table and slid into the chair opposite me without waiting for an invitation. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find me," I said, keeping my voice entirely neutral. I did not close my tablet. I simply locked the screen. "You forgot to turn off the location sharing feature on your old family phone plan," Simone replied, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I checked the grid right before you so rudely blocked my number this morning. Honestly, Jada, look at you. You are sitting here treating yourself to an $8 artisan coffee when you do not even have a place to sleep tonight. It is this exact kind of financial irresponsibility that got you into this mess in the first place." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and arranged her face into a mask of deep sisterly concern. It was a performance she had perfected over the course of 30 years. "Dad told me what he did with your apartment building this morning," she continued, her voice dropping to a loud, dramatic whisper. "He was absolutely furious about your little stunt at the retirement party. I tried to calm him down, I really did. I told him he was being far too harsh kicking you out onto the street like that. I am so incredibly worried about you, Jada. You have always been so fragile and reckless." I watched her perform without offering a single word of validation. Her fake pity was suffocating. If I were the helpless victim they believed me to be, her words would have sent me into a spiral of panic. But sitting in my quiet power, I could clearly see the cracks in her facade. Simone did not care about my living situation. She was here for a specific reason, and she was using the eviction as leverage to get exactly what she wanted. "You know you can always stay in the spare bedroom at our house," Simone offered, reaching across the table to place her hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand back and picked up my coffee mug. "We currently use that room for Andre's golf clubs and his vintage sneaker collection, but we can move them into the garage. I cannot let my little sister be homeless, even if you did bring this entirely on yourself by acting so crazy and ungrateful last night. We are family after all, and family looks out for each other." "Is that right?" I asked, taking another sip of my coffee. "And what exactly is the cost of this generous offer, Simone? Because in this family, nobody ever offers a life raft, unless there is an anchor tied to the other end." Her fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing slightly. She pulled her hand back and sat up straight, smoothing out the lapels of her blazer. "You have always been so cynical," she sighed, shaking her head as if I were a deeply disappointing child. "But since you brought it up, and since I am offering to put a roof over your head, I do actually need a tiny favor from you. It is nothing major really, just a small administrative formality." "A tiny favor," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Yes," Simone said, her voice speeding up with nervous energy. "Andre has been presented with an absolutely incredible business opportunity. It is a commercial real estate flip in the developing arts district. The return on investment is guaranteed to be massive. But because of his recent promotion and the way our corporate assets are currently structured, all of our liquid cash is temporarily tied up in high-yield offshore accounts. We just need a short-term bridge loan to secure the property." She paused, waiting for me to look impressed by her financial jargon. I simply stared at her, waiting for the trap to spring. "The thing is," Simone continued, clearing her throat awkwardly, "Andre's credit utilization is a bit maxed out at the moment because of our recent home renovations. The private lenders require a co-signer with a completely clean credit file. And that is where you come in, Jada. You live completely off the grid. You have no credit cards, no car payments, no mortgage. Your credit file is a total blank slate. We need you to co-sign the loan application. It is just a signature. We will pay off the balance in 3 months, and your name will be completely cleared." I looked at her, truly astounded by the absolute audacity of her request. She was sitting across from a woman she genuinely believed was completely broke and on the verge of homelessness, and she was demanding that I put my name on a commercial real estate loan. "How much is the loan for?" I asked, maintaining my calm facade. "It is just a small bridge loan." She waved her hand dismissively. $300,000. The interest rate is a little high at 19%, but like I said, we will pay it off before the first quarter ends. $300,000 at 19% interest. It was a predatory loan. It was the kind of financial suicide that desperate people committed right before declaring total bankruptcy. Andre was not investing in a property flip. He was drowning in toxic debt, and he was trying to use my clean social security number as a life preserver. "Absolutely not," I said. My answer was immediate and firm. Simone blinked, her perfectly applied mascara freezing. "What do you mean, absolutely not? I just told you I would let you live in my house. You are being evicted, Jada. You have no money and nowhere to go. I am throwing you a lifeline, and you are being stubborn over a piece of paper. I am not signing a predatory loan for your husband Simone. His financial mistakes are his own. I am not setting myself on fire just to keep the two of you warm. The fake sweetness instantly vanished from Simone's face, replaced by a vicious, toxic sneer. The golden child mask slipped away completely, revealing the entitled bully underneath. You owe me this. Jada, she hissed, leaning across the table, her voice venomous. Do you have any idea how many times I saved you when we were growing up? When you dropped out of college, I was the one who convinced mom and dad not to disown you completely. I was the one who smoothed things over when you refused to attend the country club galas. I covered for your constant failures. I protected you from their anger. You owe your entire meager existence to me. You are nothing but a massive disappointment, and this is your one chance to actually be useful to this family for once in your miserable life. Her words were designed to trigger a lifetime of conditioned guilt. She was employing the classic gaslighting technique, rewriting our entire history to make herself the hero and me the villain. She had never protected me. She had only used my perceived failures to elevate her own status in the eyes of our parents. She had stood by and laughed while they tore me down. I placed my coffee mug down on the saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. I looked directly into her furious, desperate eyes. I do not owe you a single thing, Simone. Not my signature, not my money, and certainly not my guilt. You and Andre built a lifestyle on a foundation of sand, and now the tide is coming in. Do not ask me to drown with you. I stood up from the table, picking up my tablet. You should leave before you embarrass yourself further, I said, looking down at her. And Simone, you might want to return that blazer while the tags are still on. 19% interest is going to severely cut into your shopping budget. I turned my back on her, leaving her sitting alone at the marble table, her mouth open in absolute shock as I walked calmly toward the exit of the cafe. I was 3 steps away from the heavy glass exit door when I heard the frantic scraping of a chair against the polished floor behind me. Simone was not going to let me just walk away. That was the one unbreakable rule in our toxic family dynamic. The golden child must always have the last word, and the scapegoat must always be put back in her place. I could hear her expensive heels clicking rapidly across the floor, closing the distance between us. She caught up to me just as I reached the crowded condiment station near the front counter. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into my skin with a grip that was entirely too tight. The sudden aggressive physical contact made me stop dead in my tracks. I turned my head slowly, looking down at her hand gripping my sleeve. I did not pull away immediately. I just stared at her fingers until she became uncomfortable and loosened her hold slightly. You do not get to just walk away from me, Jada, she hissed, her voice rising in pitch and volume. People standing in the long morning coffee line were starting to turn their heads. The quiet hum of the cafe was entirely disrupted by her frantic energy. You are a selfish, ungrateful brat. I am offering to save your life. I am offering to keep you off the winter streets, and you are treating me like garbage over a simple signature. She was purposely projecting her voice, playing the role of the benevolent savior for the wealthy patrons standing nearby. She wanted an audience. She wanted everyone in that room to look at me and see a massive disappointment. I looked around the cafe, meeting the curious eyes of the strangers watching us. In the past, this public spectacle would have crushed me. I would have instantly cowered, apologizing profusely just to make the humiliating attention stop. But today, the audience did not frighten me. It just provided me with the perfect venue to finally speak the absolute truth. Let go of my arm, Simone, I said, my voice perfectly level, but carrying enough authority to make the barista behind the counter stop wiping the espresso machine. Simone did not let go. Instead, she jutted her chin out defiantly, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. Someone needs to teach you how the real world works, she declared loudly. I took a slow breath and decided to give her exactly what she asked for. The real world, Simone, I said, speaking clearly and precisely so every single person in the vicinity could hear, is that your husband does not need a bridge loan for a commercial real estate flip. Andre needs a bailout because he has a credit score in the low 500s. He defaulted on 2 separate luxury car leases in the past 18 months. He has been pulling cash advances on high-interest credit cards to cover his massive losses in offshore day trading. And worse, he illegally leveraged the equity in your primary residence to pay off a bad margin call last quarter, and the bank is currently preparing to issue a formal notice of default. The entire coffee shop went dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the commercial refrigerators. Simone's face drained of all color, turning an ashen white beneath her expensive foundation. Her jaw dropped open slightly. Her entire false reality, her carefully constructed image of extreme wealth and superiority, had just been completely dismantled in public. She stared at me, her eyes darting back and forth, trying to process how the sister she believed was broke and living in a crumbling apartment could possibly possess the exact forensic financial details of her impending bankruptcy. "You do not want to save me," I continued, stepping closer to her, forcing her to finally drop her hand from my arm. "You need a completely clean social security number to commit financial fraud because every legitimate bank in this entire state has blacklisted your husband. You are drowning, Simone, and you thought you could use my supposed desperation to trick me into going down with your sinking ship." Cornered by the truth and exposed in front of the very social class she worshipped, Simone experienced a complete narcissistic collapse. The illusion was shattered, and her mind instantly snapped to the only defense mechanism she had left, which was absolute victimhood. She looked down at the large ceramic mug of extra hot latte she was still holding in her left hand. In a fraction of a second, her eyes hardened with pure malicious intent, followed instantly by a mask of absolute terror. She lunged forward, intentionally tilting her wrist and throwing the massive cup of scalding hot coffee directly at my lower body. The dark brown liquid splashed heavily against the front of my tailored slacks, soaking through the fabric instantly and pouring down into my leather shoes. The heavy ceramic mug hit the marble floor and shattered into dozens of sharp pieces, sending more hot liquid flying across the aisle. The heat was intense and immediate, burning against my shins and soaking my socks. But before I could even take a step back or process the physical pain, Simone launched into her theatrical performance. She threw both of her hands over her mouth and let out a piercing, hysterical sob. "Oh my God," she cried out, her voice shaking with fake devastation. "I am so sorry, Jada. My hand just started shaking. I am just so incredibly stressed out from trying to keep you from becoming completely homeless today." Tears immediately began streaming down her face, ruining her perfect mascara. She dropped to her knees amidst the shattered ceramic, playing the ultimate martyr. "I am just trying to give you a place to live," she wailed loudly, addressing the crowd. "More than me. I am just trying to help you, and you are making up these horrible, cruel lies about my family. Why are you so completely toxic to the people who love you?" The manipulation was executed flawlessly. The cafe patrons immediately reacted to the sight of the beautiful crying woman on the floor. A well-dressed man rushed forward, offering Simone a napkin and asking if she was okay. An older woman in line glared at me, her eyes filled with absolute disgust, muttering something about ungrateful siblings. Simone had successfully weaponized their natural empathy, twisting the narrative, so that I looked like the abusive monster who had just verbally assaulted her saintly sister. She peered up at me through her fingers, waiting for my reaction. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to call her a liar or throw something back at her so I would validate the crazy person narrative she was currently selling to the room. I felt the hot coffee burning my skin. I felt the heavy weight of the public judgment pressing down on me. But looking at my sister kneeling on the floor, surrounded by broken pottery and her own lies, I felt nothing but absolute victory. She was pathetic. Her grand display of power had been reduced to throwing a hot beverage like a temperamental toddler. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to explain myself to the strangers in the room. Their opinions meant absolutely nothing to my bottom line. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I walked over to the counter, my ruined shoes squishing softly with every step, and placed the money down near the register. "For the broken mug and the mess," I said quietly to the stunned barista. "Keep the change." I turned back and looked down at Simone. The cafe was completely quiet again, everyone waiting for my next move. I looked at the coffee dripping from my trousers and then locked eyes with my sister. "Your aim is terrible, Simone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying absolute finality. "But your desperation is incredibly clear." I turned my back on her, leaving her sobbing on the floor, surrounded by strangers who would forget her the moment they walked out the door. I pushed open the heavy glass exit door and stepped out into the crisp morning sunlight. The cold air hit my soaked legs, providing instant relief to the burns. I walked calmly down the bustling city street, completely unfazed by the coffee stains on my clothes or the chaotic scene I had just left behind. They had tried to break me with fear, they had tried to trap me with guilt, and they had tried to humiliate me with public spectacle. But they were completely out of ammunition, and the real war had not even begun. The return to my penthouse, leaving the chaotic energy of the coffee shop far below me. I discarded the coffee-stained slacks and changed into comfortable cashmere loungewear before walking into my home office. This was my true sanctuary. The room was soundproofed and temperature-controlled, featuring a massive custom-built walnut desk that sat in the center of the space like a command module. Behind the desk, an entire wall of reinforced glass offered a sweeping view of the Boston financial district. I could see the exact skyscrapers where men like my father spent their entire lives clawing for status, completely unaware of the digital revolution that was actively rendering them obsolete. I took a seat in my ergonomic leather chair and woke up my multi-monitor workstation. My morning was scheduled for high-level strategic reviews. Following the $42 million acquisition of my predictive algorithm, I had formed a private holding company. Our current corporate strategy was aggressive but simple. We were identifying legacy wealth management firms that were failing to adapt to modern financial technology. We looked for institutions burdened by outdated infrastructure, bloated executive salaries, and hemorrhaging client portfolios. Once we identified a target, my board would orchestrate a quiet buyout, absorbing their remaining client list and liquidating their physical assets. We were essentially the corporate Grim Reapers for old money institutions that refused to evolve. At precisely 10 o'clock, a secure notification chimed through my desktop speakers. It was an encrypted file transfer from my lead acquisition counsel. We had been aggressively scouting the New England market for a mid-sized firm to serve as our anchor acquisition for the quarter. My team knew my strict parameters. The target had to be desperate for cash, carrying a heavy debt load, and actively seeking a private equity bailout to avoid declaring public bankruptcy. I clicked the secure link and entered my biometric authentication, allowing the heavy encryption to unravel. A highly detailed 80-page digital dossier materialized on my primary ultra-wide monitor. I leaned back and picked up my stylus, preparing to review the executive summary of our latest target. But the moment the title page fully rendered, my hand froze mid-air. I simply stared at the screen, my mind taking a full 3 seconds to process the sheer magnitude of the poetic justice staring back at me. Centered on the bright white digital page was a familiar gilded logo. Below the logo, printed in bold black letters, was the exact name of my father's wealth management firm. The breath caught in my throat, not from shock, but from the overwhelming, almost intoxicating irony of the situation. This was the same firm Richard had spent his entire life building. This was the fortress of his ego, the source of his arrogance, and the weapon he had used to terrorize me for 35 years. Just last night, he had stood at a podium in a luxury country club, surrounded by his wealthy peers, celebrating his glorious legacy and publicly mocking me as a useless failure. Just hours ago, he had called my phone, threatening to make me homeless, to prove he was the master of the universe. And right now, at this very second, his precious life's work was sitting on my desk, classified as a distressed asset, practically begging my anonymous holding company for a financial rescue. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Richard had absolutely no idea. When my board initiated the preliminary buyout discussions, they operated under a strict non-disclosure agreement using a proxy corporate shell name. My father only knew that a massive, faceless private equity group was swooping in to save his firm from total ruin. He thought he was dealing with ruthless Wall Street executives. He never could have imagined that the apex predator currently circling his bleeding company was the daughter he had dismissed as a college dropout. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the walnut desk, and began scrolling through the preliminary financial disclosures. The numbers were absolutely catastrophic. The firm was not just experiencing a temporary market dip, it was fundamentally broken. For the past 5 years, Richard and his senior partners had completely ignored the shift toward algorithmic trading and automated risk management. They had relied on expensive country club lunches and outdated interpersonal networking to maintain their client base. But their wealthy clients were not stupid. They had noticed the stagnant returns and the exorbitant management fees, and they were quietly pulling their portfolios out one by one. The charts on my screen painted a picture of absolute desperation. The firm's operating capital was virtually non-existent. They were heavily leveraged, borrowing against their own corporate real estate just to meet monthly payroll for their bloated executive staff. It was a classic house of cards built entirely on vanity and ego. I clicked over to the liability section of the dossier, shaking my head at the sheer incompetence of their risk management division. They had taken on toxic debt packages to artificially inflate their quarterly earnings, hoping to attract a buyer before the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. I looked away from the monitors and glanced out the window toward the financial district. Richard was likely sitting in his corner office right now, wearing a custom Italian suit, projecting an aura of absolute control. He probably believed that securing this anonymous buyout was a testament to his brilliant negotiating skills. He thought he was securing his wealthy retirement and protecting his golden legacy. He thought he had outsmarted the market. I turned my attention back to the glowing screen, feeling the immense weight of the power I now wielded. I did not just hold the keys to his company. I held the keys to his pride, his reputation, and his entire identity. If I instructed my board to pull out of the deal today, Richard's firm would publicly default by the end of the month. He would face professional disgrace and absolute financial ruin. But simply walking away was not enough. That would be too easy. I wanted to look deeper into the rotting foundation of his empire. I wanted to know exactly where the money was bleeding from. I moved my cursor over the detailed internal audit logs, preparing to dive into the individual executive trading histories. The trap was set, and I was about to find the perfect leverage to close it permanently. I clicked past the executive summary and accessed the raw data room. My proprietary algorithm was designed to automatically highlight high-risk anomalies and toxic debt structures in bright red. When the screen finally loaded, my entire secondary monitor immediately flashed with a sea of crimson text. The volume of flagged transactions was so massive that for a brief second I genuinely thought my software had glitched. I tapped the keyboard to filter the data, isolating the firm's trading history over the past 24 months to see exactly where the bleeding had started. The financial decay was not evenly distributed across the company. Richard's personal client portfolio was slowly bleeding out from pure negligence and outdated market strategies, but it was not the source of the catastrophic debt. His trades were conservative, just incredibly lazy and out of touch. No, the real devastation was concentrated entirely within a single aggressively managed division: the Department of Alternative Investments. I pulled up the personnel file attached to that specific division. A high-resolution corporate headshot filled the screen. It was Andre wearing a smug, confident smile and the exact same custom-tailored tuxedo he had worn while screaming at me in the country club parking lot just hours ago. My father had apparently promoted him to senior vice president of alternative investments just 2 years ago. It was a blatant display of absolute nepotism, placing a man with zero actual financial talent in charge of the firm's most liquid assets simply because he married the golden child. I began pulling apart Andre's trading history piece by piece. It was an absolute slaughterhouse. He had taken millions of dollars in firm capital and poured it into highly speculative, volatile offshore markets. He was chasing massive, unrealistic yields to prove to Richard and the rest of the partners that he was a Wall Street genius. He had bought heavily into unregulated commercial real estate trusts right before the market completely tanked. When those investments began to fail, a competent broker would have cut their losses, reported the hit to the board, and accepted the professional consequences. But Andre possessed the lethal combination of massive ego and profound incompetence. Instead of admitting defeat, he had doubled down. He started trading on massive margins, borrowing heavily against the firm's own operational capital to make even riskier bets, hoping a lucky strike would magically wipe out his previous losses. I scrolled down to the third quarter projections, and my breath actually hitched in my throat. He had not just lost the firm's money. When the margin calls came due, he had quietly utilized the legacy portfolios of my father's oldest, wealthiest clients as collateral to secure high-interest mezzanine loans from unregulated private lenders. It was a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. It was not just bad business, it was a federal crime. If the Securities and Exchange Commission ever caught wind of this, Andre would be facing decades in federal prison, and Richard's firm would be dismantled by the government before sunset. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with crystal clarity. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the damning red numbers reflecting in the glass of my office window. This was exactly why Simone had cornered me in the coffee shop this morning. The $300,000 bridge loan she had practically begged me to co-sign had absolutely nothing to do with a new property flip. Andre was desperately trying to scrape together outside cash to make the minimum interest payments on his illegal loans. He was trying to keep the private lenders from seizing the firm's assets right before the corporate buyout went through. They were completely terrified. They knew that whoever bought this company would eventually conduct a forensic audit and discover the massive crater Andre had blown into the floor. They were just praying they could finalize the sale, cash out their executive equity, and vanish before the new owners realized they had purchased a ticking time bomb. The diamond tennis bracelets Simone had been wearing at the cafe, the leased sports cars Andre flaunted at family dinners, all of it was funded by defrauding elderly clients and leveraging stolen capital. I felt a cold, sharp laugh bubble up in my chest, filling the quiet penthouse office. Richard genuinely believed he was a master negotiator, walking away with a golden parachute. He had spent his entire life lecturing me about responsibility and hard work, while completely ignoring the fact that his hand-picked golden son-in-law was actively robbing him blind. Richard's arrogance had blinded him to the rot inside his own house. He was so busy trying to crush my spirit and control my life that he never bothered to verify his own company's ledger. I selected the most damning transaction logs, the ones clearly showing Andre transferring client collateral to cover his personal margin calls. I dragged them into a separate, highly encrypted folder on my desktop. I labeled the folder simply Leverage. This was no longer just a corporate acquisition, it was an execution. I did not just hold the power to fire them or bankrupt them. I held their actual physical freedom in the palm of my hand. If I wanted to, I could send these files anonymously to the federal authorities right now. But that would be too quick. That would deny me the satisfaction of looking them in the eye when the absolute reality of their situation finally crushed them. They needed to believe they were winning right up until the very last second. They needed to feel the absolute security of their fake wealth before I pulled the floor completely out from under them. I closed the audit logs and cleared my screen, returning my monitors to their standard neutral display. I picked up my phone, which had remained blissfully quiet since I blocked their numbers. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. Patricia and Richard were not going to simply let my absence tonight slide. By refusing to show up and beg for my apartment, I was denying them their favorite form of entertainment. They would inevitably try to force a confrontation on neutral ground to assert their dominance one last time before their supposed corporate buyout made them completely untouchable. I was going to let them set their little trap, because I was bringing a wrecking ball to their tea party. It only took 48 hours for my mother to make her next move. Since I had permanently blocked her primary number, she was forced to bypass my phone entirely and send a message to an incredibly old email address I had not actively used since my college days. The subject line was simply a mother's plea. The email itself was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. Patricia claimed she was deeply heartbroken over the sudden rift in our family. She wrote that she had not slept in days and that she wanted to meet me for a private one-on-one dinner at a quiet French bistro downtown. She promised there would be no arguing and no demands. She insisted it would just be a mother and a daughter trying to heal their fractured relationship over a warm meal. I knew the moment I read the first sentence that it was a trap. Patricia never wanted to heal anything unless she had an audience to applaud her immense emotional labor. A private apology was entirely outside of her psychological capabilities. But I replied to the email anyway and agreed to meet her at 8 o'clock. I did not agree because I was desperate for her love. I agreed because I wanted to see exactly what kind of desperate play my father had orchestrated now that his initial eviction tactic had completely failed to break me. I dressed in a simple tailored black dress and took a luxury rideshare to the restaurant, intentionally leaving my modest sedan parked in my secure penthouse garage. The bistro was an incredibly stuffy old money establishment with dim lighting, heavy velvet drapes, and an atmosphere that demanded hushed voices. It was exactly the kind of place Richard loved because it made him feel superior to the rest of the world. The hostess greeted me at the front podium, and when I gave her my mother's name, she immediately escorted me away from the main dining room and led me down a narrow hallway toward the private event spaces in the back. The hostess pushed open the heavy mahogany door to the private room and stepped aside. I walked in and was not surprised in the absolute slightest to see that it was not a cozy table set for two. It was a large rectangular dining table set for six. Patricia sat near the center, casually sipping a glass of expensive red wine, her face arranged into a mask of solemn disappointment. Richard sat at the head of the table, radiating absolute authoritarian dominance. Across from my mother sat Simone and Andre. Simone wore a smug, victorious smile, clearly thrilled that they had managed to corner me. Andre sat next to her, trying to look intimidating, but I could clearly see the dark, heavy circles under his eyes and the slight, nervous tremor in his hands when he reached for his water glass. The crushing weight of his impending federal crimes and his massive margin calls was actively eating him alive from the inside out. Next to my father sat a fifth person. He was a slightly balding man, wearing a cheap gray suit and clutching a thick leather briefcase on his lap. It was Mr. Caldwell, a mid-level family lawyer that Richard occasionally used for minor estate planning and bullying local contractors. The ambush was perfectly set. "Sit down, Jada," my father commanded. He did not say hello. He did not offer a pleasantry. He launched straight into his monologue, treating me like a delinquent employee rather than a human being. "We are completely done playing these childish games with you." I walked over to the empty chair at the far end of the table, directly opposite my father. I sat down smoothly, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly in my lap. I did not look at the menus. I simply looked at each of them, allowing the silence to stretch out until the tension in the room became incredibly thick. "I must say, Patricia," I began, directing my voice solely at my mother. "When you said you wanted a private mother-daughter dinner, I did not realize you were bringing the entire board of directors." My mother let out a heavy theatrical sigh and set her wineglass down. "I tried to be gentle with you, Jada," she said, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. "I really did. But your behavior this week has been entirely unhinged. You humiliated your sister in a public coffee shop, throwing a violent tantrum. You abandoned your apartment rather than simply coming home to apologize. You are acting completely erratic, and you are hurting the people who love you most." "She poured coffee on my shoes, Patricia," I stated calmly, not raising my voice an inch. But I am sure her version of the story was much more entertaining. Simone slammed her hand flat against the table. You verbally assaulted my husband's character in front of 50 strangers, she hissed, her eyes narrowing with pure venom. You are deeply unstable, Jada. You are making up wild, delusional lies about our finances because you are completely broke and incredibly jealous. That is quite enough, Richard interrupted, raising his hand to silence Simone. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and fixed me with a cold, calculating stare. He was ready to deliver his grand judgment. The point is, Jada, you have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that you cannot manage your own life. You have no career, you have no permanent residence, and you clearly have no emotional regulation. As the patriarch of this family, it is my fundamental duty to protect our assets from your reckless behavior. He gestured to the lawyer sitting next to him. Mr. Caldwell opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He cleared his throat nervously, avoiding my eyes, and slid the massive stack of papers down the length of the polished mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of me. Sitting on top of the documents was a sleek silver fountain pen. I looked down at the bold black text on the first page. It was a formal relinquishment of beneficiary rights. Your grandmother left a small trust fund intended for you when she passed away. Richard explained, his tone heavily patronizing. It matures next month when you turn 36. But given your complete financial instability and your current erratic emotional state, I have decided alongside the family lawyer that it is entirely too dangerous to allow you access to those funds. You would simply squander the money, or worse, use it to fund whatever delusional lifestyle you are currently hiding out in. He paused, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers together. Therefore, you are going to sign that document tonight. You are going to formally sign away your rights to the trust. The funds will be legally transferred directly to Simone and Andre, who actually know how to manage wealth and who actively contribute to the legacy of this family. If you sign it quietly, I will consider paying for you to see a psychiatrist to deal with your obvious mental breakdown. If you refuse to sign it, I will tie this trust up in probate court for the next 20 years, and you will never see a single dime of it anyway. The room went completely silent. Patricia took another sip of her wine, watching me closely. Simone wore an expression of absolute triumph, her eyes practically glowing at the thought of stealing the very last piece of inheritance I had left. Andre was leaning forward, practically vibrating with desperate anticipation. He needed that trust fund money to cover his fraudulent tracks before his private lenders completely destroyed him. They had brought me here to strip me of the last remaining tie to the family wealth. They wanted me to cry, to beg, or to storm out in a dramatic rage so they could comfortably validate their narrative that I was a hysterical failure. They thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the final key to my empire. I looked down at the thick legal document resting on the polished mahogany table. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint clinking of silverware from the main dining room down the hall. Mr. Caldwell, the nervous family lawyer, watched my hands closely, as if he expected me to flip the table or tear the papers to shreds. Richard sat back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting for the inevitable emotional explosion he had spent his entire life conditioning me to have. Simone had her phone resting on her lap, likely ready to secretly record my breakdown so she could play it for her country club friends the next morning. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver fountain pen. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not beg my father to reconsider or plead with my mother to intervene. Instead, I felt a genuine warm smile spread across my face. It started as a small smirk and quickly grew into a soft, audible chuckle that echoed off the velvet walls of the private dining room. The sound of my laughter completely shattered the tense atmosphere. Richard frowned, his posture stiffening. Patricia looked confused, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer. Simone uncrossed her arms, leaning forward with a look of pure disgust. What exactly is so funny? Jada? My sister snapped, her voice sharp and irritated. You are losing your inheritance, and you are sitting there laughing like a lunatic. You really have completely lost your mind. I ignored her completely. I pulled the document closer to me and flipped to the signature page. I pressed the nib of the fountain pen against the heavy watermarked paper and signed my name in a smooth, fluid motion. I did not hesitate. I did not ask to read the fine print. I simply signed away my rights to my grandmother's trust, dating the document and pushing it right back across the table toward Mr. Caldwell. The lawyer blinked in absolute shock. He had clearly been briefed by my father to prepare for a massive legal battle. He slowly reached out and pulled the document toward him, checking the signature to ensure I had not just drawn a line through it. He looked up at Richard and gave a small, stiff nod, confirming that the relinquishment was fully executed and legally binding. Richard let out a heavy breath of air, a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. Well, I must admit I am surprised, Jada, he said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. I fully expected you to throw another one of your pathetic tantrums tonight, but it seems the reality of your miserable situation has finally set in. You realized you have absolutely no power here. For once in your life, you actually did the smart thing and folded. Andre let out a massive sigh of relief, practically sinking into his chair. He wiped a thin layer of sweat from his forehead. Thank God, he muttered under his breath. We can finally put that money to good use instead of letting it sit there waiting for someone who does not even appreciate the value of $1. Simone chimed in, her voice practically singing with cruel delight. It really is for the best, Jada. You would have just blown the money on rent for another terrible apartment or some foolish little startup idea. Andre and I are going to fold the trust into our real estate portfolio. We are actually building a legacy. You should be happy that grandmother's money is staying within the successful side of the family. I looked at them sitting there so incredibly proud of their little ambush. They thought they had just stripped me of my absolute last lifeline. They thought they had finally put the rogue scapegoat permanently in her place. I stood up from the table, smoothing down the skirt of my black dress. I picked up my clutch and looked directly at my father. Enjoy your dinner, Richard, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotional weight. And Simone, I do hope that trust fund brings you and Andre exactly what you deserve. I turned around and walked out of the private dining room without looking back. As the heavy mahogany door swung shut behind me, I could hear the immediate eruption of their celebratory laughter. They were popping a bottle of expensive champagne, toasting to their brilliant victory and my crushing defeat. I walked down the narrow hallway through the crowded main dining room and stepped out into the cool evening air. The valet brought my rideshare around, and I slid into the quiet back seat, giving the driver the address to my downtown penthouse. As the car pulled away from the curb, I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window and let out a long, deep breath. The family was currently celebrating what they believed was a massive financial windfall and a masterful display of legal dominance. But they were completely blinded by their own greed and ignorance. They had no idea what I had just actually signed. Here is the hidden truth about my grandmother's trust fund. Richard had been the primary executor of that account for the past 15 years. He loved to hold it over my head, threatening to withhold the money whenever I stepped out of line. But because I had access to the back end of his firm's financial infrastructure through my acquisition data room, I had already pulled the ledger for that specific trust. Over the past decade, Richard had quietly bled the account entirely dry through exorbitant administrative fees and aggressive management charges. The trust did not hold hundreds of thousands of dollars like Simone and Andre desperately believed. The current liquid balance of that account was exactly $10,420. Andre was sitting in that restaurant right now, believing he had just secured a massive cash injection to save him from his illegal margin calls and his predatory private lenders. When he went to the bank tomorrow morning to transfer those funds and saw a measly $10,000, he was going to experience a level of panic that would completely shatter his mind. But the money was entirely irrelevant to me. $10,000 was literally pocket change. The true value of what happened in that dining room was not financial, it was strictly legal. By keeping my name on that trust, Richard had unknowingly held me hostage in a massive web of corporate conflict of interest laws. The trust was legally managed by his wealth management firm. If I had moved forward with my hostile corporate takeover while still being listed as a beneficiary of an account managed by his company, Richard could have immediately filed an injunction. His lawyers could have tied my holding company up in probate court for years, claiming a breach of fiduciary duty and a malicious conflict of interest. He could have legally blocked the sale and saved his failing empire simply because my name was tied to his corporate entity. I needed to sever that tie completely before my board finalized the buyout. I needed to become an entirely independent third party with zero legal or financial connections to Richard or his business. I had been trying to figure out how to quietly remove my name from the trust without tipping him off to my impending corporate attack. And then tonight, my father, in his endless arrogant need to control and punish me, had forced his own lawyer to draft the exact legal release I needed. He had paid Mr. Caldwell to notarize my absolute freedom. He had literally threatened me into signing the one document that cleared the path for me to completely destroy his life. I arrived back at my luxury high-rise and took the private elevator up to the penthouse. The city lights sparkled below me, a sprawling grid of power and money. I walked straight into my home office and woke up my computer. I opened my encrypted email client and drafted a single secure message to my lead acquisition counsel and the board of directors of my holding company. The message was incredibly brief. I attached a scanned copy of the legal relinquishment I had just signed, taking a photo of it with my phone before sliding it back across the table to Mr. Caldwell. Below the attachment, I typed a single sentence. All conflicts of interest have been legally severed. You are officially authorized to finalize the buyout of the target firm immediately. I hit send and watched the progress bar disappear across the screen. The trap was no longer just set. The spring had been completely released. Tomorrow morning, Richard would wake up believing he had finally broken his useless daughter. But by the end of the week, he would be standing in a boardroom staring directly down the barrel of my corporate gun. The morning sun was climbing over the Boston skyline when my secure workstation emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. It was not a standard email notification. It was the emergency alert from my proprietary predictive algorithm. I set my coffee mug down and focused on the primary monitor. The screen was pulsing with a bright red warning banner. My holding company was in the final 24 hours of the acquisition process, and my software was actively mirroring the real-time financial ledgers of my father's firm. I opened the alert. The system had just flagged a massive unauthorized transfer originating from the Department of Alternative Investments. The digital fingerprint belonged to Andre. I leaned forward, bringing up the transaction history. I could almost picture the absolute state of sheer panic Andre must have been in this morning. I knew exactly how his day had started. He would have woken up early, practically vibrating with excitement, rushing to his private bank to transfer the funds from my grandmother's trust. He probably had his creditors on hold, ready to pay off his massive high-interest debts. And then the bank teller would have handed him a slip of paper showing a balance of barely $10,000 instead of the hundreds of thousands he and Simone had arrogantly anticipated. The realization that his grand bailout was a complete illusion must have broken him. With the anonymous corporate buyout scheduled to close tomorrow, Andre was completely out of time and out of options. If the new owners took possession of the firm while his massive margin calls were still outstanding, his embezzlement would be immediately discovered. He would be fired, sued, and likely imprisoned. Desperation breeds spectacular stupidity, and Andre was currently proving that rule on a multi-million-dollar scale. I watched the live data stream as he frantically attempted to cover his tracks. He was initiating a sequence of complex wire transfers, hoping to obfuscate the origin of the funds. He was moving $3.2 million out of the escrow accounts belonging to my father's most senior clients. He was rerouting that stolen capital through a maze of offshore shell companies and then funneling it right back into the firm's primary operational accounts. His goal was twofold. First, he was trying to artificially inflate the company's liquid asset column to make the firm look incredibly profitable right before the final acquisition audit. Second, he was skimming just enough off the top to quietly pay down his illegal mezzanine loans, hoping the incoming private equity executives would simply overlook the missing client funds during the chaotic transition of ownership. It was a bold, desperate move that might have worked 20 years ago when Richard first built the firm using paper ledgers and handshake agreements. But Andre was not dealing with analog accountants. He was dealing with a machine learning algorithm that I had specifically designed to hunt down and expose this exact type of corporate fraud. My software tracked the $3.2 million through every single digital shell company, stripping away the fake routing numbers and offshore proxies in real time. It mapped the entire fraudulent network, visualizing it on my screen as a glowing red web of federal crimes. I did not even have to lift a finger to build the case against him. The algorithm was automatically compiling the Internet Protocol addresses, the exact timestamps, and the digital authorization signatures, proving that Andre was the sole architect of the embezzlement. I sat back in my chair watching the final transfer clear. He actually did it. He had just committed textbook wire fraud across international lines. I pressed a button on my keyboard, exporting the entire forensic audit into a heavily encrypted document. This was no longer just a case of poor financial management or gross negligence. This was a direct violation of federal securities law. By moving those specific client funds without authorization, Andre had guaranteed himself a minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. And the most beautiful part of the entire situation was that Richard was completely oblivious. My father was the senior managing partner of the firm. He was legally responsible for the fiduciary conduct of his executives. By failing to supervise his own son-in-law and allowing $3 million of client capital to be stolen right under his nose, Richard was legally complicit. The Securities and Exchange Commission would not just strip Andre of his license, they would dismantle Richard's entire legacy, fine him into absolute oblivion, and ban him from the financial sector for the rest of his natural life. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a secure text message from my lead acquisition counsel. The message read, "The board has unanimously approved the final buyout terms. We are ready to execute the hostile takeover, awaiting your final command." I looked at the glowing red data on my screen, holding the absolute destruction of my toxic family in a single encrypted file. They had spent 35 years calling me useless. They had treated me like a disposable burden, mocking my ambitions, and trying to break my spirit for their own twisted amusement. Just last night they had clinked their expensive champagne glasses, celebrating what they thought was my ultimate defeat. I picked up my phone and typed a quick response to my legal team. The response read, "Initiate the final phase. Schedule an emergency shareholder meeting at their headquarters for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. I will be attending in person." I locked my workstation and stood up from the desk. The meticulous planning, the silent endurance, the years of building my empire in the shadows had all culminated in this exact moment. Andre had just handed me the final nail for their collective coffin. Tomorrow I was going to walk into my father's precious boardroom not as his scapegoat daughter, but as the complete and undisputed owner of his entire reality. The morning of the acquisition, I did not wear my usual unassuming black sweater and comfortable slacks. Today required armor. My family worshipped physical displays of power. They bowed to luxury brands and aggressive posturing. I had always refused to play their superficial games, but today I was stepping onto their battlefield, and I intended to speak their exact language. I selected a pristine white silk blouse and a sharply tailored charcoal gray designer suit that fit with absolute perfection. I pulled my hair back into a sleek low bun and slipped on a pair of black leather stilettos that produced a sharp, authoritative click with every step. I looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror of my penthouse. For 35 years, my family had looked at me and seen a target. Today, they were going to look at me and see their absolute ruin. At 8:30 sharp, a sleek black town car pulled up to the front entrance of my residential building. My lead acquisition counsel, Gregory, was already sitting in the spacious back seat, going over the final physical contracts with two other senior attorneys from our corporate litigation team. They were absolute sharks men who specialized in hostile takeovers and aggressive corporate restructuring. When I slid into the car, they immediately ceased their conversation and offered respectful nods acknowledging the gravity of what we were about to execute. The drive to the financial district took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like the culmination of a lifetime. We pulled up to the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my father's wealth management firm. The building was an imposing monument to old money and corporate ego, with massive marble pillars flanking the entrance. I remembered visiting this exact lobby 10 years ago, asking Richard for a small loan to keep my startup afloat. He had made me wait in the public seating area for 2 hours before sending his assistant down to tell me he was too busy to see a failure. Today, I did not wait in the lobby. Gregory led the way, flashing a heavily embossed legal mandate at the security desk. The guard took one look at the paperwork, recognized the name of my massive holding company, and instantly swiped us through the VIP turnstiles without asking a single question. We stepped into the private executive elevator, and Gregory pressed the button for the top floor. The smooth, silent ascent felt like rising to the very top of the food chain. The heavy steel doors parted, revealing a sprawling reception area decorated in dark mahogany and brushed brass. The firm's gilded logo was emblazoned entirely across the back wall, screaming of an elegance they could no longer actually afford. The young receptionist sitting behind the massive marble desk looked up, her eyes widening in sheer panic at the sight of 4 people marching into the private suite without an appointment. She stood up quickly, her hand hovering nervously over her telephone. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice shaking slightly. "You cannot be back here. The senior partners are in a closed-door emergency shareholder meeting. We are fully aware," Gregory stated, his voice incredibly smooth, but leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are the incoming private equity group here to execute the final buyout signatures. Do not touch your phone, we will announce ourselves." The receptionist froze, sinking slowly back into her leather chair, completely intimidated by the sheer corporate force standing in front of her. I walked past her desk, approaching the heavy double mahogany doors of the main boardroom. The doors were closed, but they were not completely soundproof. Through the thick polished wood, I could clearly hear the booming, confident voice of my father addressing his shareholders. I held up a single hand, signaling for my legal team to stop and wait in the carpeted hallway. I wanted to listen to him gloat. I wanted to hear exactly how high he had built his pedestal before I completely shattered the foundation beneath it. Richard was holding court, his voice echoing off the walls of the boardroom. "Gentlemen," he projected, his tone dripping with the arrogant self-satisfaction I had hated my entire life. "Today marks a historic victory for this firm. When the market shifted and our competitors began to falter, we did not panic. We stayed the course. We maintained our prestige, and we secured a buyout offer that values this company at a premium that frankly most of the industry thought was entirely impossible." A low murmur of agreement and polite applause echoed from the men inside the room. They were completely unaware that the premium valuation Richard was bragging about was entirely based on my algorithm actively hiding their massive catastrophic debts until I was ready to expose them. They thought they were cashing out. They had no idea they were simply walking into a trap. I want to take a special moment to recognize the incredible work of our Senior Vice President of Alternative Investments. Richard continued, the immense pride in his voice making my stomach turn. "Andre has navigated incredibly complex offshore markets over the past 48 hours, ensuring our liquid assets reflect the absolute maximum value for the incoming buyers. His strategic mind is a massive asset to this family and to this corporate board." The sheer irony was staggering. Richard was publicly praising the man who had secretly embezzled over $3 million from their most senior clients just 12 hours ago. Andre had committed massive federal wire fraud to artificially pump up those liquid asset numbers, and Richard was currently claiming it as a brilliant corporate strategy. I could picture Andre sitting at that table sweating through his custom suit, his heart pounding out of his chest, desperately hoping the faceless private equity buyers would just sign the checks and let him escape before the federal authorities noticed the missing millions. We even took steps last night to consolidate some outstanding family trusts, ensuring that our legacy capital remains securely in the hands of those who truly understand the value of our work. Richard added, subtly referencing the legal document he had forced me to sign. We have eliminated all liabilities and completely streamlined our portfolio. He was actually bragging about stripping me of my inheritance. He was using his cruelty toward his own daughter as a talking point to prove his ruthless business acumen to his partners. We are about to sign the internal resolutions formally approving the transfer of ownership. Richard announced, the sound of thick paper shuffling indicating the documents were being passed around the long mahogany table. Once these resolutions are signed, the incoming private equity group will wire the funds, and we will all walk away substantially wealthier than we were yesterday. This is our legacy, gentlemen. This is what absolute success looks like. I stood in the quiet hallway looking at Gregory and the other attorneys. Gregory held the thick leather folder containing the absolute proof of the firm's worthlessness, the foreclosure notices on Simone's house, and the massive forensic audit of Andre's federal crimes. I gave Gregory a brief nod, feeling the cold, sharp adrenaline course through my veins. The trap was perfectly set, and the audience was completely captive. My father had just confidently delivered his own professional eulogy. I reached out and wrapped my hands around the polished brass handles of the heavy boardroom doors, preparing to show them exactly what absolute success really looked like. I pushed down on the heavy brass handles and forced the double doors wide open. They swung inward with a heavy thud that instantly silenced the entire room. The polite applause and the murmurs of congratulations died in the throats of the board members. I stepped over the threshold into the expansive mahogany boardroom. Gregory walked perfectly in step to my right, while the other two senior litigators flanked my left. We moved as a single, impenetrable unit. My black leather stilettos clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing like a gavel striking a judge's block. There were 12 men seated around the massive, polished table. They all wore identical expressions of absolute bewilderment. They were expecting the managing partners of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm to walk through those doors and hand them their golden parachutes. Instead, they saw me. I looked directly down the length of the long table, locking eyes with the man sitting at the head. Richard had a crystal glass of sparkling water raised halfway to his mouth. His hand froze in midair. The smug, victorious smile that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago completely evaporated. Next to him sat Andre. My brother-in-law was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, looking like a man who had just outsmarted the entire world. But the moment his eyes registered my face, and the three ruthless corporate attorneys standing beside me, his entire posture collapsed. He sat bolt upright, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He did not know exactly what was happening yet, but the primal fear of a cornered animal was already taking over his features. He knew the people standing in front of him were not lost tourists. They were executioners. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The shock was so absolute that it paralyzed the entire room. Then Richard finally found his voice. It started as a low, dangerous growl before erupting into a full-blown roar. "What in the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, slamming his glass down onto the table so violently that water spilled over the rim. He shot up from his chair, his face instantly flooding with a deep, furious purple hue. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk tie. "You have officially lost your mind, Jada," Richard bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at me from across the room. He looked wildly around the table at his partners, trying to control the narrative before his absolute embarrassment became permanent. "I apologize, gentlemen," he announced, his voice dripping with venom. "This is my estranged daughter. She is deeply unwell and suffers from severe delusions. She has been stalking the family for days because I recently cut off her financial support." He turned his furious gaze back to me. "How did you even get past the security desk?" he demanded. You are trespassing in a secure corporate facility. You think you can just barge into the most important meeting of my entire career to throw another one of your pathetic tantrums. I gave you a chance to apologize last night and you threw it away. Now you want to come crawling back begging for your trust fund while I am conducting serious business. You are a complete and utter disgrace to this family. He did not wait for me to answer. He slammed his hand down on the speakerphone sitting in the center of the table, pressing the button for his executive assistant. Sarah, he yelled into the microphone, call building security immediately. I want 4 guards up here right now. My delusional daughter has breached the executive suite, and I want her physically dragged out of this building and thrown onto the street. Tell them to call the police and press formal trespassing charges. The partners sitting around the table shifted uncomfortably in their expensive chairs. They looked deeply embarrassed for my father watching him lose complete control over his emotions in front of his peers. These were men who valued decorum and quiet power above all else. Watching their managing partner scream until he was purple in the face was completely shattering their confidence in his leadership. But they also looked increasingly terrified of the 3 men standing beside me. Gregory and the litigators did not look like security threats or hired actors. They wore immaculate, bespoke suits, carried heavy custom leather briefcases, and radiated an aura of immense legal authority. They did not flinch when Richard screamed at the top of his lungs. They simply stood there, completely unbothered by the pathetic tantrum of a man who no longer owned the very floor he was standing on. They were professionals trained to dismantle billionaires, and they were currently looking at my father like he was nothing more than a minor administrative error waiting to be corrected. Get out! Richard screamed, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his rage. He pointed toward the open doors behind me. You are going to ruin this deal. You are going to ruin my legacy. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right this second, I swear to you, I will make sure you spend the next 10 years locked in a psychiatric ward. I will destroy whatever pathetic little life you have left. Andre tried to intervene, his panic finally overriding his need to remain quiet. He reached out and placed a trembling, sweaty hand on Richard's forearm. Richard, please wait. Andre whispered, his voice shaking so uncontrollably that several partners turned to look at him. Look at them, Richard. Just look at the men she brought with her. Those are not public defenders or cheap actors. Those are corporate sharks from the financial district. Andre could sense the catastrophic shift in the power dynamic. His desperate survival instincts were actively screaming at him that this was not a petty family dispute over a cheap apartment. This was a highly coordinated hostile corporate invasion, and the sister-in-law he had spent years mocking was the one confidently leading the charge. Andre recognized the absolute danger radiating from Gregory's calm posture, and it terrified him down to his very core. But Richard was entirely too blinded by his own ego to see the reality standing right in front of him. He violently shook off Andre's hand. I do not care who she hired to play dress-up, he spat. His eyes locked onto mine with absolute hatred. She probably found 3 cheap actors to try and intimidate me into giving her that miserable little apartment back. It is pathetic. It is completely pathetic, and I will not allow this circus to interrupt the sale of my company. I stood perfectly still, letting his insults wash over me like water off a stone. Every single word he screamed only proved my point. He was entirely incapable of seeing me as anything other than a failure. His arrogance was a massive blind spot that had allowed me to build a multi-million-dollar empire right in his backyard without him ever suspecting a thing. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I did not try to argue with his ridiculous accusations. I simply let him exhaust himself. I took 2 deliberate steps forward, separating myself from my legal team and stepping right up to the edge of the massive mahogany table. The room was so tense that my simple movement caused 2 of the senior partners to physically recoil in their chairs. I rested my hands flat on the polished wood, looking directly into my father's purple, furious face. I allowed a long, heavy silence to stretch between us, ensuring that every single man in that room was hanging on my next words. Cancel the call to security, Richard. I said, my voice low, smooth, and carrying the absolute authority of a woman who owned the entire building. You are not going to have me thrown out. You are going to sit back down in your chair, close your mouth, and listen very carefully to what I have to say. Because if you say one more disrespectful word to me, I will fire you before you even have the chance to sit down. Richard scoffed, his face twisting into a sneer of pure disbelief. Fire me, he repeated the words sounding absolutely absurd in his mouth. You do not even work here. You do not even have a job. You live in a crumbling apartment and beg for handouts. You cannot fire anyone. Gregory stepped forward, unlatching the brass clasps of his heavy leather briefcase. Actually, she can, Gregory stated, his voice cutting through the heavy tension of the boardroom like a surgical blade. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on expensive watermarked paper. He placed them gently onto the polished mahogany, sliding them directly across the massive table until they came to a perfect stop right in front of my father. Gentlemen, Gregory continued, addressing the entire room while maintaining a posture of absolute professional dominance. Allow me to formally introduce the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of the private equity holding company that is acquiring your firm today. He gestured toward me with an open hand. I strongly suggest you read the ownership structure document, Mr. Managing Partner. Richard looked down at the documents resting beneath his hands. He read the top line. I watched his eyes scan the bold print. Then he read it again. The deep, furious purple hue that had flooded his face just moments ago completely vanished, draining away so rapidly that his skin turned a sickly pale gray. His jaw went slack. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing several times, but his vocal cords completely failed to produce a single sound. The senior partner sitting to his immediate right leaned over, peering at the paperwork. The man gasped audibly, a sharp intake of breath that echoed loudly in the quiet room. She owns the buying group, the partner whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She is the buyer. The room erupted into panicked murmurs. The men who had just been congratulating themselves on their brilliant exit strategy suddenly realized they were sitting across from the executioner. Now that we all understand exactly who is in charge of this room, I said, stepping right up to the edge of the table, I think it is time we discuss the actual terms of this acquisition. I reached into Gregory's open briefcase and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. I held it up for a second, ensuring every eye in the room was fixed on it before dropping it onto the center of the table with a heavy, commanding thud. Folder 1, I announced. This is the unredacted forensic audit of your entire firm. You have been sitting in here telling these men that your company is worth a massive premium. In reality, your operating capital is entirely non-existent. Your legacy portfolios are bleeding out, and your proprietary trading strategies are outdated by at least a full decade. The only reason this firm has not been seized by your creditors is because my predictive algorithms artificially masked your toxic debt to keep you alive long enough for me to buy you out for absolute pennies on the dollar. You are not retiring a wealthy man, Richard. You are leaving with exactly nothing. Your equity is completely worthless. Richard gripped the edge of the table, staring at the red folder as if it were a venomous snake. He was completely paralyzed. His entire identity, his status, his wealth, and his deeply ingrained belief in his own superiority had just been completely incinerated in front of his peers. Down the table, Andre tried to slowly and quietly push his heavy leather chair back, attempting to slip away while the focus was on my father. Sit down, Andre, I commanded sharply, my voice cracking through the room like a whip. He froze instantly, dropping back into his seat like a scolded child. I reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a second folder. This one was pitch black. I tossed it down the length of the table where it slid and stopped directly in front of my brother-in-law. Folder 2, I said, my tone dropping to a cold, mechanical cadence. Let us talk about your brilliant alternative investment strategy, Andre. Let us talk about the miracle you pulled off this morning to inflate the liquid asset column. The room fell dead silent again. The The partners leaned forward, realizing that the corporate slaughter was not over. At precisely 7 o'clock this morning, I explained, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room, you initiated an unauthorized digital transfer of $3.2 million. You pulled those funds directly from the escrow accounts of your senior clients. You routed that stolen capital through 5 different offshore shell companies, attempting to cover your illegal mezzanine loans before my auditors took over the firm. Andre let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimpering sound. He covered his mouth with his hand, his eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. The partners sitting near him physically recoiled, pushing their chairs away from him as if his crimes were a contagious disease. A massive uproar started with several executives shouting in outrage over the stolen client funds. I raised my hand, calling for immediate silence, and the room instantly complied. They were terrified of me, and they were waiting for my judgment. The data in that black folder contains the exact internet protocol, addresses, the routing numbers, and your digital authorization signatures. I continued staring dead into Andre's terrified eyes. It is a perfectly packaged federal case. If I hand this folder to the Securities and Exchange Commission, you will be facing a minimum of 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. I turned my gaze slowly back to my father, who was now shaking visibly in his chair. And Richard, I added softly, since you are the senior managing partner who completely failed to supervise him, the government will hold you legally complicit in his crimes. They will strip your financial license. They will seize your personal assets to pay back the clients, and they will drag your precious legacy through the mud on national television. My father looked like a shattered, empty shell of a man. The authoritarian dictator who had commanded my total obedience for 35 years was currently sitting in front of me, completely broken, unable to even mount a defense. But I was not finished. The ledger still had one final line item to balance. I reached into the briefcase one last time and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. I tossed it casually across the table, where it landed right on top of the black folder in front of Andre. Folder 3, I announced. This one is a personal favorite. Andre stared at the envelope but refused to touch it. He was practically hyperventilating. Since you used your own home as collateral to cover your disastrous margin calls last quarter, your private lenders have officially called in the massive debt, I explained. They filed the formal legal paperwork this morning. That envelope contains the official notice of default and foreclosure on your primary residence. By the end of this week, the bank will be changing the locks on that beautiful, sprawling suburban home you and my sister love to show off so much. I paused, letting the absolute destruction of their fake reality settle over the room. Simone will have to pack up her expensive designer clothes and her precious diamond tennis bracelets and find a new place to live. And the absolute best part of this entire situation is that my private equity group just purchased the distressed debt on that property. I own your house, Andre. I am your landlord, and I am officially issuing your eviction notice. Actions have consequences. The heavy mahogany boardroom felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly, completely sucked out of it. The silence that fell over the space was absolute and deafening. It was the exact same profound quiet that had blanketed the country club ballroom when I walked out of his retirement party just days ago. But that silence had been born of shock and social awkwardness. This silence was born of pure, unadulterated terror. The senior partners sitting around the long, polished table were completely frozen in their expensive leather chairs. Their eyes darted frantically between the 3 devastating folders resting on the wood and the absolute, undeniable authority radiating from my legal team. Andre was the first to physically break under the immense pressure. He let out a ragged, desperate gasp, clawing at his designer silk tie as if it were actively choking him. He stared at the manila envelope containing his foreclosure notice and then slowly lifted his eyes to meet mine. The arrogant, condescending brother-in-law who had chased me into a parking lot to call me a miserable failure was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified, broken man realizing that his entire existence was about to be dismantled on a federal level. He knew exactly what Simone would do when she found out they were homeless and entirely bankrupt. She would not stand by his side. She would turn on him instantly to protect her own image. He was going to lose his wife, his freedom, and his reputation all in the same afternoon. "Please, Jada," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please do not give that file to the government. I will do anything. I will pay it back. Just give me time to fix this." "You are completely out of time, Andre," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "And you have absolutely nothing left to pay it back with." The senior partner sitting to the left of my father suddenly stood up violently, pushing his chair back. He looked down at Richard with an expression of pure, unmasked disgust. "Are you completely out of your mind?" "Richard," the partner shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the black folder. "You let him steal $3 million of client collateral right under our noses. You have completely destroyed us. I am calling my personal attorneys right now, and I suggest the rest of you do the same. We need to distance ourselves from this massive liability immediately." The partner turned his back on my father and practically ran out of the boardroom, desperate to save himself from the impending federal fallout. Several other executives immediately followed suit, abandoning the man they had been praising just 10 minutes prior. They recognized that the ship was not just sinking, it was already entirely submerged, and they were scrambling for the only remaining lifeboats. Richard sat at the head of the table, watching his empire evaporate before his very eyes. For 35 years, he had controlled every single narrative. He had manipulated, intimidated, and gaslit everyone around him to ensure he always remained on top. His brain was completely hardwired for absolute dominance. When faced with this level of catastrophic defeat, his mind simply short-circuited. He stared at the red folder containing the proof of his worthless legacy. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He tried to summon the booming authoritarian voice he had used to terrorize me since childhood. He wanted to scream, to demand compliance, to threaten me into submission, just like he had done in the restaurant the night before. But the power dynamic had permanently shifted, and his body knew it, even if his ego was still trying to fight it. "Jada," he stammered, his voice weak and raspy. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "You cannot do this. We are family. I am your father. We can work this out internally. We do not need to involve the authorities or the press. I will step down. I will give you my entire share of the company. Just please do not destroy my name." It was the most pathetic display I had ever witnessed. The man who had mocked my lack of a degree, who had threatened to throw me out onto the street, and who had forced me to sign away my grandmother's trust, was now begging for my mercy. He was actually trying to invoke the concept of family to save himself after spending his entire life proving that family meant absolutely nothing to him unless it served his own selfish interests. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, resting my hands on the back of the empty leather chair next to his. I looked down at him, observing the deep wrinkles around his eyes and the noticeable tremor in his hands. I did not see a powerful patriarch anymore. I just saw a tired, desperate old man sitting in the ruins of his own massive ego. "You told me yesterday that useless people get left behind, Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and incredibly cold. "You told me that the real world does not tolerate disrespect and that actions have massive consequences. I am simply following your excellent advice. I am leaving you behind." Richard physically deflated, all the remaining fight drained completely out of his body. His shoulders slumped forward and he sank deep into his chair, looking small and entirely defeated. He could not look me in the eye anymore. He stared down at the polished mahogany table, the reality of his total destruction finally settling over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. His legacy was gone. His wealth was gone. His freedom was entirely dependent on my next move. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my pristine white silk blouse. I looked at Andre, who was silently sobbing into his hands, and then looked back at my father one last time. I wanted to ensure that my final words to him would echo in his mind for the rest of his miserable life. You were right, Richard, I said, my voice ringing crystal clear through the dead silence of the boardroom. I do not have a college degree. I just have your entire life in the palm of my hand. I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left for him to say. I turned my back on the man who had spent 3 decades trying to make me feel small. I gave a brief nod to Gregory and my legal team, signaling that our work here was completely finished. We walked toward the heavy mahogany double doors, moving with the same synchronized, unstoppable precision that we had entered with. Gregory reached out and pulled the doors open, stepping aside to let me pass. As I crossed the threshold, leaving the executive suite behind, I did not look back. I walked away from their toxic reality, leaving them completely trapped in the massive, beautiful nightmare they had spent their entire lives building for themselves. The absolute power of my silence was the only closure I would ever need. 3 months passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom closed behind me. Winter had settled over Boston, bringing a bitter cold that matched the exact reality my family was now forced to live in. The corporate acquisition of my father's firm was finalized within 48 hours of that fateful meeting. I completely dissolved the executive board, liquidated the physical assets, and integrated the remaining viable client portfolios into my own holding company. The gilded logo was ripped off the wall of the financial district skyscraper and replaced with completely empty space. The fallout for my family was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. My algorithm's forensic audit was anonymously delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission exactly as I promised. The federal authorities did not waste any time investigating. Less than 2 weeks after the buyout, federal agents raided Andres' temporary office and his sprawling suburban home. They seized his computers, his physical files, and every single luxury vehicle sitting in his driveway. The federal indictment came down hard and incredibly fast. Andre is currently facing multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and severe violation of fiduciary duties. His private lenders completely abandoned him the moment the government froze his remaining assets. He is currently out on bail awaiting a federal trial that his cheap public defender has already warned him he absolutely cannot win. The man who used to mock my lack of a degree and scream at me in country club parking lots is now staring down the barrel of a 15-year mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The stress has completely aged him. I read in a local business blog that his assets are entirely depleted and he is struggling to even pay the daily fees for his ankle monitor. And then there is Simone. When the bank formally foreclosed on their house, my holding company officially took possession of the property. I did not give them a standard 30-day notice. I gave them exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. Simone had to pack her expensive designer clothes and her precious diamond tennis bracelets into cheap cardboard boxes, while the wealthy neighbors she had spent years trying to impress watched from across the street. The repo men arrived the very next morning to tow away her leased luxury SUV because Andre had completely defaulted on those payments as well. With Andre's accounts frozen and their credit completely destroyed, Simone was forced to face the real world she used to lecture me about. She could no longer rely on nepotism or offshore accounts. She currently works at a mid-tier retail clothing store in a suburban shopping mall far outside the city limits. I know this because one of my junior analysts saw her there last week while shopping for a holiday gift. According to the report, Simone spends her days folding sweaters, organizing clearance racks, and dealing with incredibly demanding customers, while standing on her feet for 8 hours a shift. The golden child who believed she was entirely superior to the working class is now completely dependent on minimum wage just to afford groceries in her cramped, rented apartment. The humiliation of serving the public has completely shattered her fragile ego. My father did not fare any better. Richard was forced into an immediate, uncelebrated retirement. There were no country club speeches or crystal champagne toasts for his departure. The federal investigation into Andre's massive embezzlement directly implicated Richard for gross negligence and an absolute failure to supervise his own senior executives. To avoid a lengthy and humiliating public trial, Richard surrendered his financial licenses completely and agreed to a massive federal settlement that drained whatever personal savings he had left hidden away. He is no longer the powerful patriarch of the Boston elite. He is a total pariah in the financial sector. His wealthy golfing buddies immediately distanced themselves, canceling their Sunday tea times and completely ignoring his phone calls. The Beacon Hill Country Club formally quietly revoked his membership to avoid being associated with the ongoing federal scandal. He lost his firm, his money, and his highly guarded reputation, all in the span of a single afternoon. He and Patricia were forced to sell their massive colonial home to cover the legal fines. They now spend their days sitting in a heavily downsized rented townhouse, completely stripped of the power and influence they used to wield like a blunt weapon. Despite their absolute destruction, they still tried to reach out. They truly believed that blood gave them an unconditional pass for a lifetime of abuse and manipulation. Yesterday afternoon, my secure personal phone rang, displaying an unknown local number. I knew immediately who it was. I let the phone ring out and go straight to voicemail. When I finally sat down at my desk and listened to the recording, the sound of my mother's frantic weeping filled my quiet office. Patricia had finally been broken by the crushing weight of their new reality. Her voice was shaking, completely devoid of the smug superiority she had carried to the French bistro 3 months ago. "Jada," she sobbed into the receiver, "please pick up the phone. We are losing absolutely everything. Andre is going to prison and your father cannot even afford his heart medication this month. Simone is so depressed she can barely get out of bed to go to her awful job." She paused, taking a ragged breath before launching into her final desperate manipulation. "We are your family, Jada. You cannot just leave us like this to rot. Please call me back. I know you have the money to fix this. I am begging you to help us. We are so incredibly sorry for everything we ever did to you. Please just come home and help your family." She cried for another 2 minutes, spinning a pathetic web of guilt and desperation. She tried to invoke the memories of my childhood, hoping to find some hidden reservoir of daughterly obligation. She wanted me to swoop in and use my massive wealth to pay Andre's legal fees, buy back Richard's reputation, and rescue Simone from the indignity of retail work. She wanted the scapegoat to magically become the savior. I sat in my quiet, warm penthouse looking out over the beautiful city skyline. I listened to the entire voicemail from start to finish. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a sudden urge to rescue them. I simply felt the profound, peaceful closure of a permanently closed chapter. For 35 years, they had demanded my compliance through fear and emotional manipulation. Now they were demanding my money through manufactured tears and weaponized guilt. Nothing had actually changed. They did not love me. They only loved what my bank account could do to save them from their own terrible choices. I reached out and pressed the delete button on the screen. The recording vanished instantly, completely erased from my device and my life. I tapped the screen one more time and permanently blocked the new number, ensuring Patricia could never reach me again. There would be no grand reconciliation. There would be no tearful family reunion where all is forgiven and forgotten. Forgiveness is a gift reserved for people who actually show remorse before they are facing the absolute destruction of their own making. I placed the phone face down on my mahogany desk and opened a new corporate file on my computer. I had a multi-million-dollar empire to run, and I refused to spend another single second of my life looking backward. I had successfully excised the tumor that was my family. The bleeding had finally stopped, and the wound was permanently closed. I was entirely free. I pushed back from my desk, leaving the corporate files open on my monitor, and walked toward the massive glass doors of my office. I unlatched the heavy lock and pushed the door open, stepping out onto the wrap-around terrace of my penthouse. The bitter Boston winter wind immediately hit my face, but I did not shiver. The cold felt incredibly grounding. I walked over to the thick glass railing and rested my hands on the freezing metal, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city skyline. Below me, millions of lights flickered in the early evening darkness, representing millions of different lives and stories. Directly to my left, towering above the neighboring buildings, was the skyscraper that used to house my father's wealth management firm. The space at the very top where his massive gilded logo had proudly glowed for decades was now completely dark and empty. It was a permanent void in the skyline, a massive physical reminder of what happens when arrogance collides with absolute reality. For so many years, I used to look at that building from the tiny, drafty window of my cheap apartment and feel a crushing sense of inadequacy. I used to wonder why I was not good enough to earn a seat at their table. I agonized over what was fundamentally wrong with me that made my own parents treat me like a disposable burden while they showered my sister with endless praise and financial support. I spent my 20s desperately trying to figure out how to decode the secret language of their love. But standing here tonight, holding the absolute deed to my own life, I finally understood the greatest irony of my family dynamic. Being the designated family scapegoat was not a punishment at all. It was the ultimate competitive advantage. When you are the golden child like Simone, your entire existence is a non-stop performance. You are constantly burdened by the suffocating expectations of toxic parents. You have to marry the right person, attend the right galas, and maintain the illusion of absolute perfection at all times. Simone was never actually allowed to be a real person. She was just an extension of Richard's massive ego. That constant pressure to perform is exactly what drove her and Andre to leverage their entire lives on toxic debt. They were so terrified of losing their golden status that they were willing to commit federal crimes just to keep up appearances. Their privilege was actually a beautifully decorated prison cell. But because I was the scapegoat, I was completely invisible. They wrote me off as a failure the moment I dropped out of college. They stopped paying attention to me. They stopped monitoring my moves. And in that complete and total isolation, they accidentally gave me the greatest gift any entrepreneur could ever ask for, which is absolute unbothered silence. The shadows they banished me to became my ultimate training ground. Because nobody expected anything from me, I was completely free to fail, to experiment, to learn, and to build without the heavy burden of their judgment. I did not have to justify my long hours or explain my complex software algorithms to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. While they were busy hosting extravagant dinner parties to show off their leased luxury cars, I was sitting in my freezing apartment, writing the code that would eventually dismantle their entire world. They thought they were burying me, but they had no idea I was a seed. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is absolutely everything. We are told to forgive and forget, to turn the other cheek, and to always keep the door open for toxic blood relatives because family is forever. But that is a dangerous lie designed to keep victims trapped in endless cycles of abuse. True power is not about having millions of dollars in a private banking portal. True power is the absolute unyielding ability to establish a boundary and enforce it with zero apologies. The moment I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to seeing me as worthless was the exact moment my entire life changed. The moment I accepted that I would never be the daughter Richard wanted was the moment I became the CEO he could never defeat. I stopped seeking a seat at their table and decided to buy the entire building instead. If you are listening to this right now, and you are the black sheep of your family, I want you to hear these words very carefully. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. Your refusal to blindly conform to their toxic dysfunction is a massive sign of strength. When they call you useless or difficult or overly sensitive, it is simply because they cannot control you. Their rejection is not a reflection of your true value. It is an absolute, undeniable reflection of their profound limitations. When they try to diminish your accomplishments, let them. When they mock your quiet life or your modest choices, do not waste your breath trying to convince them of your brilliant potential. Let them completely underestimate you. Let them believe they have won. Use the silence they force upon you to focus entirely on your own growth. Work in the shadows, build your resources, and protect your peace at all absolute costs. Because while they are busy talking and tearing you down, you can be quietly constructing an empire they will never have access to. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to finally find your own true worth? Have you ever been the scapegoat who quietly built a beautiful life while the golden child completely collapsed under the weight of their own ego? I want to hear your stories of triumph and boundary setting. Tell me exactly how you broke the cycle and reclaimed your power in the comments section below. I read every single one of them because our shared experiences are the ultimate proof that healing is entirely possible. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories about navigating toxic relationships, securing your financial independence, and exacting the sweetest kind of quiet revenge. Share this video with someone who might be struggling with a difficult family dynamic right now and needs a reminder that walking away is not a failure, it is a glorious rebirth. Thank you so much for being part of this journey with me tonight. And remember, when they close the door in your face, do not stand there knocking. Turn around, walk away, and go build your own castle. You are the sole author of your destiny, and your best chapters are still waiting to be written.